Hey guys, I'm back. So I hope you've had time to think a little bit about attachment theory. Um, and it's kind of crazy if you think about it. I mean, how would people come up with these ideas? Um, and the point I'd like to make with this part of the lecture, and as you're thinking about putting your questions and your ideas together, that it's a combination of good, smart science, creativity, and kind of what's going on around you, what's going on in your life, that helps you think of research that really matters. And in order to do good research, honestly, the researchers should be excited and passionate about what they're doing. Because as you'll see, research is a lot of work. So, as an example, I talked about Mary Ainsworth and I talked about attachment theory. I have a little treat for you. I'm going to read to you from her biography. So she passed away probably about 20 years ago. And in order to honor her, the American Psychologist, a really big research journal for developmental psychology, which is a lot like human development, honored her with a special issue. And this is some of some of the article which was on her biography. And I want you to think about how Ainsworth got her research ideas. She was born in Glendale, Ohio in 1913. Her family moved to Toronto when she was 4. And that's where she grew up. She received her bachelor's in psychology from the University of Toronto in 1935 and her doctorate in 1939. And think about that for a minute. 1930s, how many women actually went to college and how many beyond that even got their doctorate? She said, after I got my doctorate degree, I was hired at the university as a staff member. When World War II broke out, most of the men left for the service, and I filled a position as a lecturer in the psychology department. And I always have to chuckle a little bit there because all the men had to go away before they'd let the women work. But in 1942, she decided she wanted to be where the action was and joined the Canadian Women's Army Corps. Although she didn't get to the action, thank goodness for us, she did perform important work in personnel selection. After the war ended, Ainsworth worked for a year as superintendent of women's rehabilitation for the Canadian Department of Veterans Affairs. In 1946, she returned to the University of Toronto as an assistant professor and taught courses ranging from research methods, yay, to personality theory and assessment. In addition to teaching, Ainsworth did research in human security. Her lifelong research into mother-child relationships started shortly after she married Leonard Ainsworth in 1950. Now, of course, because this was the 50s now, she moved to England while her husband attended school at the University of London. So she got a job at a research center called the Tavistock Clinic, and she joined a team of researchers directed by John Bowlby. And I mentioned Bowlby before because he was the ethologist who worked with mammals and started thinking about attachment theory from a mammalian perspective. So the team was investigating the effects of personality development in young children when they were separated from their mothers for extended periods of time. She said her research at the Tavistock Clinic profoundly influenced her later work. She said the emphasis on the research I did at the clinic was on the effect that hospitalization had on very young children. What we found was that it truly made a big difference when the child saw very little of his or her mother for long periods of time. At first, the separation was something that was very hurtful, and the children were very unhappy and cried a lot. But after a few weeks in the hospital, as though they couldn't stand it anymore, they just shut the door psychologically. At first, the child wanted to be with the mother and hug them. But if they didn't see their mother for a few weeks, they'd be completely indifferent to her when she did arrive. The discoveries that Ainsworth and Bowlby made during their research had a major effect worldwide. Before Mary and Bowlby did their work on hospitalized children, mothers were not allowed to stay with their babies in the hospital. They found that this sort of separation was psychologically dangerous for babies. This led hospitals around the world to change their policies so parents could remain with their children. That same work led to a shift from orphanages to foster homes. So it really had a big difference on, made a huge difference on how we think about family life, especially for children who aren't lucky enough to have an attachment figure. So Ainsworth's work at the Tavistock Clinic showed the importance of the bond between mother and child, particularly during the first year. Her later work in Uganda went far in explaining how this bond was formed. So, of course, because we're still in the 50s, Ainsworth accompanied her husband to Uganda in 1954 after he got a job as a psychologist with the East African Institute for Social Research in Kampala. Not one to remain idle for long, Ainsworth drummed up support for a project to study the interaction of Ugandan mothers with their babies. She said, "My study in Africa derived from my work in London. Everyone expected the villagers to be unfriendly toward me, but when the women found out what the situation was, they were really interested in taking part in the program." What she did was study 28 babies as they developed over a period of months, and these months later became known as the attachment period. She drove an elderly Peugeot. A Peugeot is a little French car, from village to village. She would visit the families in the study and watch the babies and mothers interact. Generally, what she found with Ugandan mothers applies to mothers around the world. Actually, there were far more similarities than she had expected. So if you think about that, that kind of proves farther what Bowlby's idea of that attachment being a universal, hardwired thing into human beings. So in 1955, she and her husband moved to Baltimore, and she was hired as a psychologist in the psychology department at Johns Hopkins. She continued her research on mother-child interactions and pioneered a study of mothers and children in their homes. As her research withstood close scrutiny, people tested and looked at her evidence, and it passed the test of time, she began to be showered by awards from the American Psychological Association and the American Academy of Pediatrics. She said, "Quite a lot of my wanting my own child played into my life work. I wouldn't have expected this at the time, but I could see it now. If I was encouraged at all, I'd pick up a baby, hold it, bounce it on my lap, and display affection. I have great confidence in the truth of what I found in my work. That's why I tell people never miss an opportunity to hold a baby." Because that's that mothers meeting babies' needs. So I just love that story, and I love hearing about her because there's so much that was going on in her life, being one of the only women in psychology at that time, thinking of family relationships, which is something that many women tend to do. And just incidentally, she never did have her own child, but she did have hundreds and hundreds of children around the world, and she made a really big difference in their lives. So I just wanted you to see that even though you think about the research and it seems very sterile, and there are rules, we are very strict on we have to have evidence, we have to follow the right methods, because we want to make sure that our science is good, sound science, because we make a lot of decisions based on that. But still, there's a lot of creativity and really a lot of personality in the projects if you look deep and think about the lives of the researchers and what else their influences. So the next part of our lecture is on science and research. And basically what I'm doing here is I'm just stepping back a little bit and giving you some larger context of the scientific method, because the research methods are really tools as part of the scientific method. So your book talks about the basic assumptions of science. And I know this sounds sort of freaky. We are getting very, very theoretical here, things we don't think about every day. But when it comes down to it, these are the things that have to be true for us to accept science. The first basic assumption is that a true physical universe exists. We're not all living a dream. We're not in the imagination of God. We assume, our assumption is that a true physical universe exists. And I don't know if you guys saw Lost, but that whole story didn't exist. So we're assuming that a true physical universe exists, and we're also assuming that underneath it all, that the universe is primarily orderly. There are rules that govern how things happen. There are gravity, there are the laws of physics, things happen in an orderly way. They're not chaotic, there are rules that they follow. We are also assuming that the principles can be discovered, that the human mind is capable of discovering the principles, that our brain power can understand the principles. Told you guys this was getting a little freaky, but it makes sense. True physical universe, the universe is primary orderly. The principles can be discovered. And then this last one is really important. The ideas are tentative and can be changed by new information. And that's been really important in the whole field of science over the past 100 and 150 years. Science builds upon each other. Studies build upon each other. So we might believe one thing might be true, and the existing science says that it's true, and then other studies might come along and disprove that as we gain in our understanding of the world. And the best example of this comes from, and it drives us crazy, comes from nutrition. If you look at the magazines, it seems like every couple years there's different ways we should be eating. And it's not entirely because journalists want to find stories. It's because the science actually changes. The state of science, as we get better and better at learning about what's going on in the human body, we can change our mind. We find out new things, better things. So I'm going to stop this right here and have you guys click into a movie that I like to show. It's called Time Travel Dietitian, and it was actually recommended to me by a friend, which gives a really humorous example of how science changes by new information. So I'll see you back in a little bit.